More mashed potatoes, sweetie? The gentle voice belonged to Maggie Rodriguez. And for 18 years, it had been the soundtrack of lunchtime at Riverside Elementary. The kids called her Lunch Lady Maggie, and she'd served over 2 million meals with the same patient smile, the same caring questions about homework and soccer games. What they didn't know was that the soft hands now spooning green beans had once broken a grown man's neck in 3 seconds, and the woman they saw as just another cafeteria worker had trained the deadliest Marines in United States history. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden strength, maternal protection, and the day a quiet lunch lady became the most dangerous person in the building, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe heroes come in unexpected forms, hit that subscribe button. Some warriors never stop fighting. They just change battlefields. Riverside Elementary School in Cedar Falls, Iowa, was a kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Built in 1987, it housed 340 students from kindergarten through 5th grade, along with staff of teachers who'd mostly grown up in the same small town. The school sat on 12 acres of corn country, surrounded by the kind of endless fields that made Iowa famous, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual Harvest Festival or a particularly good football season at the high school. Margaret Rodriguez had been part of this world since 2005, when she'd answer a classified ad for a cafeteria position that offered health benefits and summers off. To the hiring committee, she was a godsend, a middle-aged woman with references from a previous food service job in Colorado, clean background check, and the kind of maternal energy that made children feel safe. They didn't ask too many questions about the gap in her employment history from 1988 to 2004, and Margaret didn't volunteer information about what she'd been doing during those 16 years. What they got was the most beloved staff member in school history. Margaret, Maggie, to everyone who knew her, arrived every morning at 5:30 a.m. to prep lunch for hundreds of hungry kids. She knew every student's name by October, remembered their food allergies, asked about their sick grandparents, and somehow made even the federally mandated vegetables taste good. She never missed a day, never complained about the pay, and treated every child like they were her own grandchildren. At 58, Margaret looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for caring lunch lady. 5'4", graying brown hair always pulled back in a net, soft around the middle from years of taste testing her own cooking. She wore the standard food service uniform, khaki pants, white polo shirt, comfortable shoes designed for standing all day. Nothing about her suggested danger or violence or the kind of past that left scars on both body and soul. But sometimes, if you knew what to look for, you could catch glimpses of something else. The way she moved through the kitchen, economical, precise, never wasting motion. The way her eyes automatically scanned every room she entered, cataloging exits and potential threats. The way she could lift 50-pound sacks of flour like they were bags of marshmallows. Most telling of all was her posture, straight-backed, alert, the bearing of someone who'd spent years standing at attention. The kitchen staff hadn't noticed these things over the years, but attributed them to good genes and a strong work ethic. Margaret's assistant, Carol, a chatty woman in her 40s who'd worked in food service her whole life, sometimes made jokes about Margaret's military-like efficiency. Maggie runs this kitchen like a Marine drill sergeant, Carol would say, not knowing how close to the truth she was. Margaret would just smile and keep working, the way she'd learned to deflect attention during her years of hiding in plain sight. Because Margaret Rodriguez wasn't just a lunch lady who happened to be organized. She was Staff Sergeant Margaret Rodriguez, USMC, retired, former senior drill instructor at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island, where she'd broken down and rebuilt more than 3,000 recruits over her 16-year career. She'd trained Marines who went on to serve in Desert Storm, Bosnia, Somalia, and the early years of Iraq and Afghanistan. She'd shaped boys into men, turned civilians into warriors, and earned a reputation as one of the toughest, most effective drill instructors in Corps history. Her nickname among the recruits had been Iron Maggie. Not because she was cruel, but because she was absolutely unbreakable, completely committed to making sure every Marine under her command had the skills and mental toughness to survive combat. But that was another life, another person. In 2004, After watching too many of her former recruits come home in flag-draped coffins, Margaret had quietly submitted her retirement papers and disappeared into civilian life. She'd chosen Iowa specifically because it was peaceful, safe, the kind of place where the closest thing to violence was a heated school board meeting about the dress code. For 18 years, the strategy had worked perfectly. Margaret Rodriguez, the lunch lady, was completely different from Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the drill instructor. Different personality, different life, different problems. The only connection between them was an instinct for protection that she couldn't quite suppress, even in the safety of an elementary school cafeteria. That instinct was what made her notice the man in the parking lot. It was 11:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, exactly 30 minutes before lunch service was scheduled to begin. Margaret was checking the temperature on the chicken nuggets when she glanced out the kitchen window and saw him, tall, thin, early 20s, standing next to a rusted pickup truck with out-of-state plates. He wasn't moving toward the building, wasn't getting back in his vehicle, just standing there staring at the school with the kind of intensity that made Margaret's internal alarm system start ringing. She'd seen that look before. In Iraq, on the faces of insurgents conducting surveillance before an attack, in training exercises, on the faces of Marines learning to assess targets. It was the look of someone planning something, calculating variables, preparing for action. Margaret stepped closer to the window, using the angle to get a better view without being seen. The man was wearing a long coat despite the mild weather, and his right hand kept moving to his hip in a gesture she recognized from years of weapons training. He was checking something, a weapon, most likely the way nervous soldiers touch their rifles before a mission. Maggie, Carol's voice snapped her back to the present. The kids are going to be here soon. You okay? You look tense. Margaret forced a smile and turned back to the warming trays. Just thinking about the inventory report. You know how paperwork stresses me out. But she wasn't thinking about paperwork. She was thinking about exit routes, about the 237 children currently sitting in classrooms throughout the building, about how long it would take police to respond to a call from a rural elementary school. Most of all, she was thinking about the combat. Action ribbons she kept hidden in her jewelry box at home, earned during a deployment to Somalia when her supply convoy had come under attack, and she'd killed 3 armed insurgents with nothing but a sidearm and 18 years of Marine training. Because Margaret Rodriguez might look like a harmless lunch lady, but if someone was planning to hurt the children under her protection, they were about to discover that some Marines never really retire. They just choose different battles to fight. At 11:47 a.m., the man in the parking lot started walking toward the main entrance, and Margaret's blood turned to ice. She'd been hoping he was just a lost parent or a delivery driver checking his GPS. But the way he moved, purposeful, determined, scanning the building like he was counting windows and calculating angles, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a predator approaching his hunting ground. Margaret moved quickly but quietly to the kitchen phone, dialing the main office while keeping her eyes on the intruder. The secretary, Mrs. Patterson, answered on the second ring. "Main office, this is Linda." "Linda, it's Maggie in the kitchen. We need to implement lockdown procedures immediately. There's a suspicious individual approaching the building." "Are you sure? I don't see anyone on the security monitor." "Trust me, Linda. Lock down the school. Now." Margaret hung up before Linda could ask more questions. Through the kitchen window, she could see the man had reached the front entrance and was trying the doors. When he found them locked, standard procedure during school hours, he didn't leave or knock or try to check in at the office like a normal visitor would. Instead, he walked around the building, testing windows, looking for another way in. The lockdown alarm began blaring through the halls, a sound that always made Margaret's chest tight, because it meant children were in danger. Over the intercom, Principal Davis's voice carried the calm authority of someone who drilled the scenario dozens of times but never expected to use it for real. "Teachers and students, we are implementing code red lockdown procedures. Please secure your classrooms immediately. This is not a drill." Margaret could hear the sound of organized chaos as teachers locked doors, moved children away from windows, and tried to keep 300 young voices quiet. But she wasn't thinking about procedure anymore. She was thinking about the fact that the intruder was now at the side entrance near the gymnasium, and she could see him pulling something from under his coat. A shotgun, sawed-off, modified for close-quarters work. The kind of weapon that said this wasn't about robbery or vandalism. This was about maximum casualties in minimum time. Margaret's training kicked in like muscle memory. Assess the threat. Protect the civilians. Neutralize the danger. She moved through the kitchen with mechanical precision, turning off all the equipment, securing the knife block, and grabbing the only weapon she had available, a meat tenderizer with a heavy steel head. The sound of breaking glass came from the gymnasium entrance, followed by the distinctive metallic click of a shotgun being pumped. Margaret's mouth went dry. He was inside. Carol was frozen by the prep station, eyes wide with terror. "Maggie, what's happening? Is someone trying to break in?" "Listen to me very carefully," Margaret said, her voice taking on a tone that Carol had never heard before, sharp, commanding, absolute. "You're going to go into the walk-in freezer and lock it from the inside. You're going to stay there until the police arrive, no matter what you hear. Do you understand? But what about you? What are you going to do?" Margaret was already moving toward the kitchen entrance that connected to the main hallway. "I'm going to do my job." The hallway was eerily quiet except for the sound of footsteps. Heavy boots on linoleum, moving with purpose toward the main corridor where most of the classrooms were located. Margaret pressed herself against the wall and listened, her mind automatically calculating distances, timing, angles of approach. The shooter was methodical, not rushed. He was checking doors, looking for unlocked classrooms, planning his attack. Margaret could hear him trying to handle Mrs. Johnson's first-grade classroom, then moving on when it didn't open. He was working his way down the hall systematically. It was only a matter of time before he found a door that hadn't been properly secured or decided to start shooting through the locks. Margaret closed her eyes and made a decision that she'd been avoiding for 18 years. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was coming out of retirement. When she opened her eyes again, everything was different. Her posture straightened, her breathing slowed, and the soft, caring expression that had defined lunch lady Maggie disappeared, replaced by something harder, more focused. She moved down the hallway with the silent precision of someone who'd spent years learning to hunt human targets, the meat tenderizer held in a combat grip that would have been familiar to any Marine who'd trained under her command. She could hear him now, maybe 50 feet away, still checking doors. His footsteps had a slight irregularity, favoring his left leg, probably an old injury. Margaret filed the information away automatically, the way she'd once taught recruits to assess enemy weaknesses in urban combat scenarios. "Hey!" The shooter's voice carried down the hallway, loud and aggressive. "I know you're in there. Come out now and nobody gets hurt." It was a lie, of course. Margaret had seen enough violence to know that men who brought shotguns to elementary schools weren't interested in negotiation. But she could also hear something else in his voice. Adrenaline, nervousness. The pitch of someone whose plan wasn't going as smoothly as he'd expected. Good. Nervous shooters made mistakes. And Margaret Rodriguez had spent 16 years teaching Marines how to exploit those mistakes. The next sound she heard made her blood freeze. A child's voice, muffled but clear, coming from one of the classrooms ahead. Some teacher hadn't gotten their door locked properly, or a student had panicked and tried to run. Either way, the shooter had found his target. Well, his voice carried a sick satisfaction. Looks like someone forgot to follow the rules. Margaret moved faster now, abandoning stealth for speed. Whatever was going to happen next, she needed to be there when it did, because she'd made a promise 18 years ago when she'd taken this job. Not explicitly, not officially, but the kind of promise that every protector makes to every innocent under their care. "No one hurts my kids. Not on my watch." The shooter was at the door of room 15, Mrs. Garcia's third-grade class, 26 8-year-olds who'd probably never seen real violence in their lives. Margaret could see him now, tall and thin like she'd observed from the kitchen, but up close she could also see the sweat stains on his shirt, the slight tremor in his hands, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. He wasn't professional. He was angry, unstable, probably dealing with personal problems that had pushed him over the edge, that made him more unpredictable, but also more vulnerable to the kind of psychological warfare that Margaret had perfected during her years breaking down cocky recruits who thought they were tougher than they actually were. You know what your problem is? Margaret called out, her voice carrying the parade ground authority that had once made grown men cry. You picked the wrong school. The shooter spun around, bringing the shotgun to bear on this new threat. But what he saw wasn't what he'd expected. Instead of a terrified teacher or a cowering administrator, he was facing a middle-aged woman in a lunch lady uniform who was looking at him like he was something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Lady, get back in the kitchen where you belong," he snarled. "This doesn't concern you." Margaret smiled, and it wasn't a nice expression. "Son, everything that happens in this building concerns me, and you just made the biggest mistake of your very short life. You think you're scary?" Margaret's voice carried down the hallway like a whip crack, and something in her tone made the shooter take an involuntary step backward. "Let me tell you what scary looks like. Scary is a Marine drill instructor who spent 16 years turning boys into killers, and you just threatened her kids." The transformation was complete now. Gone was the soft-spoken lunch lady who remembered every child's birthday. Standing in that hallway was Staff Sergeant Margaret Rodriguez, USMC, and she was absolutely furious. The shooter tried to regain control of the situation. "I've got a gun, lady." "You've got what? A kitchen utensil? Get back before I—" "Before you what?" Margaret interrupted, taking a step forward instead of back. "Before you shoot an unarmed woman? That's your plan? That's what you think makes you dangerous." She took another step, and her voice dropped to the level she'd once used with recruits who were about to wash out of basic training. "I've seen dangerous. Son, I've trained dangerous. I've been dangerous since before you were born. You want to know the difference between you and me?" The shooter was clearly confused by her approach. Most people faced with a shotgun either ran or begged. They didn't advance while delivering what sounded like a lecture. "I don't know what your game is, old lady, but—" "The difference," Margaret continued, still moving forward, "is that you brought a gun to feel powerful. I don't need a weapon to be dangerous. I am the weapon." It happened faster than the shooter could process. Margaret dropped into a crouch, rolled left to avoid his line of fire, and came up inside his guard before he could adjust his aim. The meat tenderizer caught him in the solar plexus with surgical precision, driving the air from his lungs and doubling him over. The shotgun clattered to the floor as Margaret grabbed his head with both hands and brought her knee up to meet his face. The impact was audible throughout the hallway, the sound of cartilage breaking, and a grown man learning that age and gender meant nothing when you were facing someone who'd killed people with her bare hands. The shooter went down hard, blood streaming from his nose, gasping for air. Margaret kicked the shotgun away and placed her foot on his throat, applying just enough pressure to keep him conscious but helpless. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice now carrying the calm authority of someone completely in control. "You're going to lie there and think about the choices that brought you to this moment. You're going to consider how lucky you are that I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago, because that person would have snapped your neck and moved on to lunch prep." She could hear sirens in the distance, police response, finally arriving. But Margaret wasn't worried about backup anymore. The threat had been neutralized, and her kids were safe. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" The voice came from behind her, small and uncertain. Margaret turned to see Principal Davis emerging from the administrative wing, his face pale with shock. What just happened?" "I took out the trash," Margaret said simply. "Might want to call the paramedics too. I think I broke his nose." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Police officers, paramedics, FBI agents who'd been en route since the first emergency call. The shooter was taken away on a stretcher, conscious but thoroughly subdued. Margaret found herself answering questions from detectives who seemed more interested in her background than in the incident itself. "Ma'am, your response was unusually effective for someone in food service. Do you have any military or law enforcement training?" Margaret looked at the detective, a young man who probably hadn't been born when she was breaking her first recruit at Paris Island. "I've had some experience dealing with difficult people." But the real moment came when the classrooms were finally unlocked and the children were released. Margaret was standing in the main hallway, still wearing her food service uniform, still looking like the same lunch lady who'd served them chicken nuggets yesterday. But now, there was something different in the way they looked at her. 8-year-old Emma-chan was the first to approach. Miss Maggie, my mom says you saved us. Is that true? Margaret knelt down to Emma's level, and for the first time in hours, her expression softened back into something recognizable. We all kept each other safe today, sweetheart. That's what families do. Are you really a soldier? Asked Marcus Thompson, a fourth grader who'd been fascinated by military history since kindergarten. I was, Margaret said carefully, a long time ago. But now I'm your lunch lady, and that's a much better job. More children gathered around, and Margaret found herself surrounded by the same kids she'd been serving for years. But now they were looking at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity that made her uncomfortable. Will you tell us stories about being a soldier? Asked Sarah Martinez. Will you teach us how to fight bad guys? Added Tommy Rodriguez. Margaret stood up slowly, feeling every one of her 58 years. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll keep making sure you get good lunches and that you're safe at school. That's my job now. But as the children were led away by their teachers and parents who'd rushed to school, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't quite the same person who'd arrived at work that morning. The carefully constructed facade of lunch lady Maggie had been cracked, and something harder and more complex was showing through. Principal Davis approached her as the building finally began to empty. Margaret, I don't know how to thank you. What you did today, I've never seen anything like it. I did what needed to be done, Margaret replied. Nothing more, nothing less. The district is going to want to do something special. Recognition, maybe a ceremony. The media is already asking questions. Margaret shook her head firmly. No ceremonies. No media. I'm not a hero, Mr. Davis. I'm a lunch lady who had some training that came in handy. That's all. But even as she said it, Margaret knew that things had changed irreversibly. For 18 years, she'd successfully hidden her past, lived a quiet life, served meals and kept secrets. Now the secret was out, and there was no going back to the simple existence she created. 3 weeks later, Margaret was back in her kitchen at 5:30 a.m., prepping lunch for 340 students who now looked at her differently. The morning routine was the same, checking inventory, setting up warming trays, reviewing the day's menu. But everything else had changed, and Margaret was still learning how to navigate her new reality. The media attention had been intense despite her refusal to cooperate. Lunch Lady Hero Stop School Shooter had become a national story, with news crews camping outside her house and reporters trying to dig into her military background. Margaret had said nothing, but enough details had leaked from various sources to paint a picture of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's distinguished career. The children, predictably, had become fascinated with their lunch lady's secret identity. They peppered her with questions about the Marines, about combat, about whether she knew any Navy SEALs or Special Forces soldiers. Margaret answered carefully, always steering the conversation back to food and school and normal things. But some conversations were harder to deflect. Miss Maggie, 10-year-old Jake Morrison, had asked just yesterday, "My dad says Marines are killers. Did you ever kill anyone?" Margaret had looked at this boy, bright, curious, innocent, and felt the weight of 16 years of service and 18 years of hiding. "Jake, Marines are protectors. We learn to fight so that other people don't have to. Sometimes it means doing hard things, but it's always to keep good people safe. Like you kept us safe? Like I kept you safe." The hardest part wasn't the questions or the attention. It was the way her carefully constructed civilian identity was being dismantled piece by piece. Margaret had worked so hard to become someone normal, someone peaceful, someone who fed children instead of training warriors. Now that person felt like a costume she could no longer wear convincingly. Carol, her assistant, had been walking on eggshells for weeks. "Maggie, can I ask you something? When you told me to hide in the freezer that day, you knew exactly what was going to happen, didn't you?" Margaret paused in her prep work. "I knew someone was planning to hurt children. I knew I couldn't let that happen. But you weren't scared. Everyone else was terrified, but you just took charge, like you'd done it before. Fear is a luxury you can't afford when people are depending on you," Margaret said quietly. "I learned that a long time ago." The real conversation had come from Principal Davis, who'd called her into his office the week before with an expression she couldn't read. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you say won't affect your job here, but the district is implementing new security protocols, and they want to know if you'd be willing to serve as an advisor." Margaret had been expecting this. What kind of advisor? Emergency response planning, staff training for crisis situations. You have experience that could save lives. "Mr. Davis, I came here to leave that life behind. I don't want to be the school's security expert or tactical consultant. I want to be the lunch lady." "I understand. But Margaret, what happened 3 weeks ago proved that you can't completely leave that life behind. It's part of who you are. Maybe the question isn't whether you want to use those skills, but how you can use them to keep doing what you love most, protecting these kids." Margaret had asked for time to think about it, but she already knew what her answer would be. Because Principal Davis was right about one thing. She couldn't go back to being just a lunch lady. That person had been a fiction, a comfortable lie she told herself about who she could become. The truth was more complicated. She was Margaret Rodriguez, former Marine Staff Sergeant, former drill instructor, former warrior who trained thousands of soldiers and survived combat in 3 different countries. She was also lunch lady Maggie, who knew every child's name and food allergies and worried about their nutrition and happiness. Both versions were real. Both versions mattered. And maybe it was time to stop pretending they were incompatible. The lunch bell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Within minutes, the cafeteria would fill with children who'd learned that their lunch lady was capable of violence but chose kindness instead. They'd line up for their trays with the same easy trust they'd always shown, but now with an added awareness that someone was watching over them who would never let them be hurt. Margaret smoothed her hairnet, checked the warming trays one final time, and took her position behind the serving line. The first student through was Emma Chun, the 8-year-old who'd asked if Margaret had really saved them. "What's for lunch today, Miss Maggie?" Emma asked, holding out her tray. "Chicken and dumplings," Margaret replied, spooning out a generous portion. "Made from scratch this morning. And Emma, make sure you eat your vegetables. You need to stay strong." Emma nodded solemnly and moved on, followed by a steady stream of children who trusted Margaret Rodriguez to feed them, protect them, and send them back to class well-nourished and safe. As Margaret served lunch to 340 students that day, she realized something important. She'd spent 18 years thinking she was hiding from her past, but she'd actually been preparing for her future. Every child she'd fed, every name she'd learned, every small kindness she'd shown had been building toward the moment when all her skills, military and civilian, warrior and caregiver, would come together for a single purpose. She wasn't just a lunch lady who used to be a Marine. She wasn't just a Marine who became a lunch lady. She was something new entirely. A protector who understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with chicken nuggets and patience and the absolute certainty that every child deserved to feel safe while they learned and grew. That afternoon, Margaret made 2 phone calls. The first was to Principal Davis, accepting the advisory position with the understanding that her primary job would always be feeding kids. The second was to the Marine Corps Association, agreeing to speak at their annual meeting about transitioning from military to civilian service. Because Margaret Rodriguez had finally learned something that had taken her 58 years to understand. You don't stop being a Marine when you hang up a uniform. You just find new ways to serve, new battles to fight, new people to protect. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, your new mission feeds 340 children every day and sends them home safe to their families. Some warriors retire to golf courses and fishing boats. Others retire to elementary school cafeterias, where they serve lunch with one hand and guard the future with the other. Margaret Rodriguez had found her place, and she was exactly where she belonged.